stand today for the readings of God's Word from Matthew 2. I'm kind of skipping around, so I don't have it behind me. I kind of want to get out of the habit at times, actually, of putting the words up there and encouraging you to bring a paper Bible, as I actually just left mine over there and will read it digitally, so I'm a hypocrite. But I'm going to read these words from Matthew 2, skipping around a little bit between verses 1 and 26. It says this: After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem, and they asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Skipping to verse 7. Then Herod called the Magi secretly, and he found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." Verse 12. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they, being Joseph and Mary, the Magi, they returned to their country by another route. And when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, and he said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and escape to Egypt." That should sound thematically familiar. "Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." And so he got up, and he took the child and his mother during the night, and they left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were two years old and younger. This is the word of the Lord. Beautiful. You can be seated. One of the things that sets you and I apart from every other living, breathing creature, maybe even the dog in your house that right now is shedding or tearing into the trash against your will, is that we are the only species of creatures that we're aware of today who tell stories. We weave stories together to make sense of our world and to make sense of our place in that world. Stories are a big reason why we love sports. And I don't know if you watched the news this week, but there were some big news in the sports world of West Virginia football this past week. It's why we love to throw press conferences and parties and see the numbers as they magically line up with a pick game to reflect the game of 17 years ago. We are attached to these moments, not just for the people involved or the sport at play, but because of the story that sits underneath it. We love stories. We're formed by the stories that we see. And so when it comes to the story, the overarching story being told 1,000 different ways with all of these different variations and characters and moments and history through the Bible, a story we're now weaving through the season of Advent, the invitation is always to us, not just to see another world, but to begin to inhabit it as if it's ours, to live in it. Farshid is a Christian right now living in Iran. And Iran is a country where it is illegal to own a copy of the Bible or to gather in the name of Jesus in any way. Meaning that what we are doing right now without fear or threat is the same thing that right now he and his brothers and sisters in Christ about 8 hours ago, meeting secretly in underground churches, did under threat of imprisonment and execution. And last year, a missionary friend of mine, who I won't name for safety reasons, traveled to Turkey to help lead a pastor's conference, primarily made up of Iranian Christians. And for 3 days, Farshid, this stranger just a day before, became the mouthpiece, the translator by which my friend spoke in English and he interpreted to these Iranian pastors in Turkey. So when my friend rested at night, having preached 6 to 7 times per day, teaching a group of hungry believers in a far-off land, Farshid did not rest. He stayed up even later, poring over the manuscripts and the outlines of my friend's teachings so that when it came to, in the moment, any word that would have brought him confusion tomorrow, he could meet with succinct clarity of its intended meaning. And these conference goers, in their day-to-day lives back in Iran, they regularly risked their lives to gather in these underground churches throughout the nation. And interestingly, by the way, in the only way that God can get credit, statistically speaking, the church in the Persian world, where that is happening, threat of imprisonment and death, is the fastest growing location of the church in the world today. Farshid is part of that, but at a great cost. You see, before he worked on a stage in Turkey translating my friend's messages, he was first the victim of an infamous day in church history in Iran. It was Christmas Day 2010, where there was a coordinated and well-organized national raid against house churches throughout the country. So after leading a celebration on the birth of Christ the night before among his small underground congregation, Farshid the next morning had been tipped off through a series of calls from the government telling him that he needed to come home immediately to talk. And Farshid was out that morning because he was a father of 2 small children who he was dropping off at their elementary school. You see, Iran doesn't take Christmas Day off because it's not a national holiday. So the morning after leading his final Advent service that year, he found himself bending down to look his 7-year-old daughter in the eye, the older of the 2, saying, "Daddy loves you so much, but I don't think I'm going to see you for a while." And then dropping her off at school, when he returned home, he was arrested. He spent the next year of his life in solitary confinement in a cell too small for him to lay down fully in. No mattress, just 1 pillow and a blanket, and he was allowed a 2-minute shower once per week. After that year, he was moved into general population where he spent the next 9 years. He would not see his daughters for 10 more years until his oldest was 17 years old. I have 3 daughters, my oldest almost being the age of his oldest when he had to say goodbye. And when I think about the moment he had with his daughter and what it would have been like for me to endure that, the cost that father has paid to tell the story that we just read a moment ago becomes far more clear. And honestly, I've not been able to read the Bible quite the same since I heard about my friend of a friend, Farshid. So when I read, now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, I don't think about a story that's quite so easily dismissible or easily sanitized and stripped of its rawness. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Well, sure, if you're sucking on a candy cane between sips of a hot cocoa strolling through the aisles of Target. But what about Farshid? What about for Mary and Joseph running for their lives back to the land of their people's historic enslavement and genocide? What about King Herod repeating the sin of Pharaoh and laying a genocide on the people in hopes to quell a rising people? Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright? Nah. We're story people. And there is hope and there is healing and ultimately love that's meant to be found in this story. But you and I, as we come into another week of Advent, if you want the real story, then you're going to have to resist the urge to sanitize and sentimentalize it and instead take it at face value. Because both Matthew and Luke's account starts the story with a corrupt, tyrannical ruler calling for a global census that bats the poor and the oppressed around like unnoticeable dust particles in the air. That's where the story known as Advent goes down, not a silent, holy night where all is calm and all is bright. So on the docket today is Herod. I don't know if you picked that up on the selection of reading that we had today. Last week, we tried to get past the shell of religious nostalgia by looking at Mary. Today, we have the same goal. We're going to talk about the dark character, the anti-Advent, anti-Christmas reality, not the anti-word or a specific kind of cup at your favorite coffee joint, like anti-God dude, doing everything he can, including killing all the boys 2 and under to hold on to his power. And we're going to look at that and see, what does that speak to us today? And as we do that, I just want to issue this challenge. And not my friend, but he might as well be my friend because I pay a lot of attention to his writing. John Tyson said it better than I could. He said that the problem with living in a secular culture like ours is that we have removed the components of Christmas that enables the transformation of heart. And so as a result, what you get is the shell of religious nostalgia without the potency of religious power. All that to say, let's not hollow this thing out and thus remove it of its transformative power. So on the docket, Herod, a little crowd participation again. Let's create the profile just like last week for all you extroverts and bold people. Shout it out. What do you know about Herod? He's king. Mean and nasty, as my mother-in-law says. He's what? He's an adulteress. He's got lots of women. In fact, he kills them if they begin to threaten his power. What else do you know? He's a poser. Rich, poor? Rich. Some would say the richest man to have ever lived. He's quite into himself with lots and lots and lots of building projects. And if you've ever been to the Holy Land, you have seen them, you have walked them. If you've been to Masad, you have walked up that hill or taken the tram. This guy is ruthless. He's rich, he's anxious, he's paranoid, he's a murderer, he's a political opportunist, he's a lot of things. And it's interesting, history likes to kind of sentimentalize his story, strip it of its rawness, and we call him Herod the Great. And that idea of Herod the Great has nothing to do with his inner character, but really his outward posture of success and wealth and domineering. Herod is the human equivalent of an apple that you take a giant bite out of because it looked good on the outside, only discover a mouth full of rotten nastiness. So here arrives Jesus. Here's the story. Here arrives Jesus, and the good news, the angel to the shepherd says, this is good news for all people. Only this is not such good news to King Herod. Let me say that again. The same good news that for Farshid is worth risking imprisonment and execution, and he spent 10 years of prison away from his family, that good news is really good to Farshid. That good news is really good to Madison and to Derek, who are on the front end of a journey longing to follow after Jesus. That good news is enough for you to show up in some way or form this morning, but it is not good news to Herod. Herod's acting like a guy that has competing loyalties all over the place. He's a guy straddling multiple worlds. Is he an opportunist, or is he a rich and powerful guy with an identity crisis, or is it some wicked combination of all of that? Well, a little background. Herod is part of a family that actually came from the people of Idumea, which was the Greek pronunciation of the Hebrew word Edom, or the Edomites, who lived in southern, what today we call Jordan. An interesting series of events happened 150 years prior to this scene with Herod and Jesus, where the land of Idumea was conquered by a Jewish king. And that Jewish king forced all the people of that area to convert to Judaism. And we know how well forced conversions seem to go in history and in life. Shout out to the power team. I got saved because they ripped those phone books 17 times in my childhood. And so Herod was an Idumean whose family had converted to Judaism historically, but in a forced way. As in, it doesn't mean a lot. So when Herod, the political opportunist with Jewish practice in his household among the Jewish people, sees a vacuum of power in Jerusalem, the home of the Jews no less, after Rome has swept through the empire, he saw his chance. And using his family wealth, he bought his way into power, he paid off people, he gave lifts, he built buildings for people. He got power by handing people money. Kind of a story. Typical story of politics. And so watch this. Herod is a dude with all kinds of inner conflict. Politically, he's Roman. He's appointed by Octavian Caesar Augustus. Ethnically, he's an Edomite. Religiously, he's Jewish. But culturally, he's Greek. His preferred speaking language and his preferred architectural style for all the things he built in that time is Greek. He's a dude with crazy, competing, and divided loyalties. This is a man with power, wealth, and prestige, and angst, and identity issues. And he's not sure who he is, and he, underneath it all, has a divided heart. What's my point in giving you that history lesson? There's good reason that Jesus' arrival banished fear for some, but for Herod, it caused him fear. And we'll mine that out in a minute, but here's my point. Herod is the anti-Advent character in the story. His entire existence opposed the coming of God's kingdom because it threatened his own. But Herod's story is not just Herod's story. It's bigger than Herod's story. So you ready to do a little thread work today? Let's pull the thread on Herod and go all the way back to Genesis chapter 25. We're going to skip the garden for today. You know what happened there. We get to Genesis 25. Some 2,000 years before Herod is the story of Jacob and Esau. This is actually where Herod's story begins. And there's not enough time to frame up all that's happening right there. But Abraham, Father Abraham, had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. I'm one of them. So are you. So everybody do the wiggle. What? The wiggle? Jacob is, Abraham, grandpa. Isaac is married to Rebekah, and Rebekah becomes pregnant. And in Genesis 25:22, we read that Rebekah is experiencing some pregnancy not funs. And it says this, that the babies jostled each other within her. She's pregnant with twins. And she says, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, this is a lot. Could you imagine hearing this from God? Like the twins, they're really kicking a lot today, and you ask in prayer, and God responds with this. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. And when the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. 2 sons warring within her womb, Jacob and Esau. Do the long thread of genealogy. Eventually, Jacob becomes affectionately known as Israel. He is renamed Israel. Esau later becomes the father of the Edomites, which later become known as the Idumeans. And so catch this, downline of Jacob comes Jesus, and downline to Esau comes Herod the Edomite. In Genesis 25, Jacob and Esau were 2 nations warring within the same womb. And in Matthew 2, Herod and Jesus represent the same 2 nations warring in the same world. Good versus evil right in front of us. The cosmic story that gives weight to every other story that plays in. Now watch this. In Numbers 24, another prophecy was uttered, and it says this, that I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of all the people of Sheth. Edom will be conquered. Seir, his enemy, will be conquered, but Israel will grow strong. A ruler will come out of Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city. Are you seeing it come together? Do you see the cosmic story at play right in front of us? The war that began between Jacob and Esau in the womb of Rebekah all those years is finally reaching a fever pitch in the struggle between the reign of Herod and the birth of Jesus. So Herod, at least at a household level, is Jewish enough, maybe that's a little judgy, he's Jewish enough to be familiar with these stories. If Herod is truly Jewish in the way that we think he was historically, he would have grown up on the stories that would have known these prophecies. He would have known the story of Jacob and Esau. He would have known the two lineages from which he comes, and he would have come into this moment. What do you mean a star has risen in Bethlehem out of Jacob's line? A conqueror, a king of Israel is being raised up. How do you think that sets with the guy with the most power, autonomy, building materials? This dude is the king of his own kingdom, and he knows it. I imagine Herod to be freaking out. I also imagine, can you take this creative license with me? It's believed that Herod's favorite palace is known as Herodium. Any of you that's been there, to the Holy Land, you've probably been here. It's this colossal palace with over 47 lookout towers. And it's situated just between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. That on the right weather, on the right angle of one of those towers, it's conceivably possible that you could look one direction and see this town, Jerusalem, and one direction and see Bethlehem. So here is Herod, king of the Jews of Jerusalem, looking one direction, and those are his people that he has conquered. He's convinced he's actually helped rebuild their temple. He has manipulated them to regain some of their trust and loyalty. And to the other direction is Bethlehem, where this new poser of a baby that people are saying is going to be a king is his greatest threat. And so suddenly the king in fear, maybe looking one direction, seeing the seat of his power, looking the other direction, seeing the dethroning of his power, maybe sitting there in fear of losing his kingdom, he remembers the words of another prophet, one that's quoted by Matthew, Micah 5, chapter 2, where it says, "You, Bethlehem, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." But wait, I'm the ruler of Israel. I've earned this. I have straddled the line between competing loyalties and money and favor and authority and hatred and murder. I have worked my entire life striving to keep things in my control, me in the driver's seat. What was good news to others became bad news to Herod. Do you see that? Do you see how human that is? Jesus, the light of the world, has come in the flesh. He has come to shine a light on the dark world, darkness that is personified in Herod. The Son of God has put on flesh and bones, and he's stepped into time. He's moved into the neighborhood, and he's become the son of Joseph from the line of Jacob so that he could dispel the darkness that lives in and through Herod. A human, a man of complicated family origins, a man who lived with constant identity struggles, insecurities, and paranoia, all of which expressed themselves with daily striving to maintain his own sense of power and autonomy and control, never in submission to a greater God or authority. The good news that came for all, the good news that sent Farshid to prison, the good news that saved Derek and Madison, who we baptized earlier, the good news that's reaching down into this room right now was anything but good news for Herod. Jesus the light showed up to a dark world. And we, too, like Herod, have a way of letting our own stuff squeeze out God's light, because whether we want to admit it or not, we perceive his love, we perceive his grace, we perceive the presence of him in our lives as a threat to us. Herod is an extreme version of an all too familiar story. It's the story of my friend Zach, who showed up to Christian school from 5th grade on, had hundreds of chapels and church services under his belt, where he was physically present for every single one of them, but spiritually numb and in a distant land. And work slowly became his God and success his identity. A near-death car wreck had to get his attention to wake him up, that God was not a threat, but he was his comforter and he was his healer, and he could put together the pieces of his life back together just the way that he's putting back the pieces of his broken body. It's the story of my friend T, whose father wounds from childhood rocketed her down a life seeking affirmation from men who were easy to hook up with, but never right to marry. That is, until she got pregnant and ended up marrying the man who wasn't just her baby's daddy, but became her abuser. It's the story of my friend Josh, who had it all together until he didn't. And his fear of rejection and sense of inferiority was so strong he could never admit, even to his closest friends and family, anything that was actually going on in his internal world. And today, he lives between moments of total unraveling, when all he would have to do is to welcome the light into his own darkness. All he would have to do is sit back into God's love and acceptance of him, rather than striving to earn the thing that he's already been freely given. Herod's story sounds extreme, but it's awfully familiar. It's every time you and I wake up and we decide, nah, I got this. It's every time the gentle voice of God whispers to your heart, and for whatever reason we dismiss it, we ignore it, we rationalize it, we discount it. It's every time you and I show up casually to a gathering like this, expecting nothing, because the God of our imagination doesn't love us enough to meet us as we are. Herod built cathedrals and temples and palaces of his own making. He is widely considered as the richest man to ever live, and he did a great job building an empire in his own image. And I can't help but to think about the hundreds of ways I'm tempted to do the same. Herod crowded God out of his life, and we do it too. What was good news to Farshid was the most real threat to Herod. What was good news to the shepherds in the middle of the night was the most disruptive threat that could ever be given to Herod. What is good news being poured into this place right now through Scripture, through the words we sing, through the evidence of God's salvation, can still come up against our religious veneer, against our shame, against our hurt, against our pain, against our hard hearts, and be seen as a threat when it is actually the power of God's salvation and healing being offered to us. Herod crowded God out of his life, and we do it too. And so the question I want to ask is, why? Why? You know the stories, you know the prophecies, you're seeing the signs, you're seeing all this stuff happening. How is it possible, Herod, that you are seeing the star rise, you're seeing the Magi travel, you know the stories are coming to fulfillment in front of you. How is it possible for you to crowd God out of your life in that moment? I'm not talking about Monday morning where you're running late and God seems like a distant thought of your imagination. I'm talking when all the spectacle, signs, and wonders are in front of you. My answer to that, I think, is just in one word, and that word is fear. Why would Herod crowd God out of his life? Because he was scared of what that meant for him. When Jesus arrived, and the angels kept appearing in encounter after encounter, declaring and announcing and comforting to Mary and Joseph and shepherds and magi and who knows what else. Constantly they're saying, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. The words that released fear and silenced worry and killed doubt to most became a shudder down the spine for Herod. Fear. When God's presence came near to Herod, it exposed him for who he truly was. You see, when the king walks into the room, and by that I mean like just King Jesus, and his presence overwhelms us. When the king walks into the room, it's good news for everyone, except those trying to convince the world or maybe just convince themselves that they are the king. It's good news for everyone except for those too scared to come out of hiding, to risk being loved, to risk being accepted for who you truly are. It's better to be casually loved but never fully known than to be fully known and to risk not being fully loved. And I believe that inside of the church of our time, inside of our church, is the kingdom breaking in. It's the reality of heaven invading earth right now. But the corresponding blind spot that many of us carry, and the corresponding blind spot of the church, of our time, is that there's very little longing for it. And there's very little longing for Jesus even to come and show up again. My life, the Western world, is one where there are interruptions of pain, but the consistent experience is comfort. For Farshid, the normal life is consistent moments of pain and suffering with interruptions of comfort. Same story, vastly different ways of experiencing the story. What for Farshid is good news, that's power to salvation, that is hope and hope eternal. It is a greatest story to live for under threat of human power and fear and corruption. For us is just another rainy Sunday. And when comfort is the defining experience, and pain and suffering is the interruption, you tend to think a whole lot more about these little moments of the kingdom that are sprouting up here and now than you do about the kingdom being at hand and the return of the king himself to bring peace and peace only and peace all the time. So that's good news. It's a good thing because heaven really is invading earth right now, and God really is renewing the world through his people and through his church. And the king walked in first as a helpless infant, and the king will come a second time, but this time without a disguise. The light of his presence will do to all of us what it did to Herod. It will lay bare every hidden layer of every human heart. It will expose the secret motives of my ego, the secret habits of our private lives, the secret judgments in our mind, and the secret behavioral patterns that I manage but I don't confess. Every one of us will be found helplessly in need of mercy in the presence of the returning king. And here's what's incredible, is that God is big enough to walk beside you as your friend, comforting you in the place of your need. And he's big enough to return as king, riding in on a white horse for the whole world to tremble in awe and fall to their knees. This is the cosmic story up at hand in front of us, and this is the cosmic story that we find home in. And that's good news to everyone who's not trying to convince themselves that they are king. Here's the good news that could cause great joy this morning, is that the returning king sees our hearts for what they are, and his mercy forever outpaces his judgment. His judgment has been settled. It's been poured out. You see, the layers of my heart, they can actually come undone before this king. The layer of my friend Josh's heart, who he has never become unraveled, but I'm praying he does, and that's not his real name, so don't start speculating. When the layers of his heart become laid bare before his king, then it's like a surgeon finally able to wield their knife to draw out and to cut out the sin and every hesitation in his heart. But until he puts himself on that table, it's limited. And just as a father has compassion on his children, that's how God relates to us. As high as the heavens are above the earth, that's how far his love reaches. And as far as east is from the west, that is how far his forgiveness stretches. He is the father who is running out to meet you and I. He is the rabbi that cooks you breakfast on the beach, as he did with Peter. He's the shepherd coming and finding you as you walk away on the road to Emmaus. He's the supernatural risen Savior who appears to Thomas in the midst of his doubt. Peace, joy, hope, love. These Advent themes are a fearless way of living in a contested world. And they come only by receiving love in the very place of your deepest fears. Even the fear that you might dress up with a crown and a robe and lavish building projects and career and image just like Herod did. The deceiver's original lie is still his only trick. It's to warp your view of God and to teach you to hide from the one who would heal you, to fear being exposed in a long line of those helplessly in need of mercy. Let me bring this together. The other night, we're driving home from Winfield Middle School's band concert. And the girls, we've trained them. Eliza's training them on this one. I love it. I'm here for it. When it gets to a certain part of the night, it's time to just put on some calm music. Start maybe help those little wild things begin to calm and decompress. And so they asked for, Daddy, can you put some calm music on in the car? And me, being me, thought this was the perfect time to introduce them to 2004 Enya. Any Enya fans out there? We listen and we don't judge. But I used to play Enya while I read the Chronicles of Narnia books. Super nerd alert. And I got in the car. I mean, Dad's like, I thought I raised something totally different. You bought the boombox, so you're complicit. So I got quiet in the car after Enya began to play. And Eliza could tell my mind was in a different place as I was being transported to the world of Narnia and back to my childhood. And she was right because it was there, but I was also thinking about the ending to this message. And the music we were listening actually took me to a scene from one of the books, The Horse and His Boy. Well, this is one of the books in the Narnia series. And I was thinking there as we're driving between Winfield to our house, playing Enya, as one does. And I was thinking about the scene when Shasta, the main character, got lost. And he's alone and he's afraid in this long, winding journey in the wilderness. And he doesn't know where to go in the pitch black of the night. And he also doesn't know how to get back to where he started or to get where he intended to go when he set out. He is completely and utterly lost. And he starts to become fearful. And fear is very much experienced like Shasta on this road, because fear makes you and I suddenly aware that we don't know. We're not king. We're not God. I'm not in control. We don't know how to get back to where we came from, and we have lost track of where we were going from where we set out in the first place. And it's about that time that Shasta hears it. In the dark, alone on this winding journey, he hears heavy breathing behind him, inhaling and exhaling. Inhaling and exhaling. There's something or someone eerily close to him. And so he keeps walking, and he's trying to get away from the breathing and whatever this is. But every step he takes, he continues to hear it. Heavy breathing. And eventually, he musters the courage to say what he had been thinking. And he says, "Who are you?" And at that moment, the lion, Aslan, which is Lewis's depiction of Jesus, responds, "One who has waited long for you to speak." So here's Shasta, fearful, not remembering where he was going or how to get back to where he started, hopeless, lost, wandering about, and he hears the breath of God behind him. And he finally musters the courage to say, "Who are you?" And Aslan, Jesus' character, simply says, "One who has waited long for you to speak." You see, what I'm trying to show you is that Jesus is the King of the everlasting kingdom. And when he makes his return, he will come in glory so plain that every knee will bow. And Jesus is the friend who is walking with you, your companion and your guide on the journey. And he is waiting. And he is so kind and he is so gentle that he will walk with you, but he will wait for you to speak to him. He will wait for you to call to him so that in your calling he can forgive you and heal you and help you and love you and remove every burden of fear and set your life back squarely in the way and in the story he wanted it to be part of. Your heart this morning is the most contested space of your life. And often the greatest journey that you have to travel is the gap between this and this. What you believe and how you live, who you really trust, the concepts of God and your experience of him. And it's weird to call all of us Herod because he's the bad guy, right? He's the corrupt, powerful. I've never murdered anyone. But underneath it all, Herod is the all too familiar story of someone who, when God's presence became near him, he shrunk back in fear of what we would reveal about him and change the things that he actually longed for, but was too fearful to say yes to. So here's my closing thought. I just want to simply say this. Jesus is with you. He's walking behind you. He's pursuing you. He's nearer to you than you are to yourself. And he is waiting for you to speak to him. Reach out and let the light in. Don't live like Herod forever, paranoid and self-protecting and struggling and fragile and anxious and worried. Don't destroy your life to keep control of it. Find life in Christ. So would you stand? So a friend reached out to me this morning and expressed to me some things going on in his life. And he gave me permission to share it if I felt like it would encourage us. And I feel at this moment it would. And so I'm going to do my best to describe it in the form of an invitation to all of us. God has healed this. God is healing this friend of a struggle with alcoholism. And for the last few years, he's been on the road to recovery, free in sobriety, 3.5+ years, I believe. That, prior to that, divorce of his first wife, daughters with that wife. The wife has also struggled with addiction, has continued to be someone enslaved to the trappings of drug addiction right now. Been 5 or 6 years since they last spoke. She called him out of the blue this week. But she didn't just call him out of the blue. My friend prayed a really dangerous prayer this week, in the last couple weeks. And the prayer was basically, God, you saved me, you're saving me from alcoholism. You're putting my life together. And I hate my ex-wife. I hate what she's done to our family. I hate that she's abandoned our kids. But if it's for me, it's for her too. And so, God, would you just reach her? And then a few days later, she calls him for the first time in 6 years and says, I want to reestablish a relationship with our daughters. And so, if I were him, and I'm not, and at some point he can share this story, I would have a lot of feelings. One of them being fear. Oh my gosh, here we go again. The other being, God, if you're the God who walks beside and behind the wanderer down the complexities of every wilderness imaginable, including my own alcoholism and the failure of my own marriage and the pieces of me that you're putting back together, who am I to withhold that from her? The shepherds respond immediately. The magi, their journey's a bit longer. We tend to discount the journeys that take longer and give up on them faster than God's heart would be. And so I'm sharing that for a lot of reasons, but I think the clarity in my heart about why to share it right now comes from the thing that he expressed to me, almost in a prophetic word, that he said might be for some. And so I'm going to put it out there, and if it resonates, it might be a moment like Madison experienced when I accidentally called people failures, and that was the moment that made it more real to her than ever that God was saving her. And this is the line that kept coming to him in prayer. And it says, do you remember praying for the things that you are now complaining about? Do you remember praying for the things that you are now complaining about? And so we just pause. We ask, come Holy Spirit. On a day where the darkness of Herod has been our focus, many of our minds may have gone to the Herod that's in our life or in our past. What if things would have been different? Why didn't you? Every part of my flesh wants to say, no, let them reach the end of the path they're on. But the part of me that finds hope in you says, if you can do it for me, you can do it for them. And so, Jesus, would you come, King? Would you walk into the room? And may we not see that as being exposed in fear, but being invited to healing in the deepest parts of us. The parts that reach into our past, the present, and all the way into the future. And so if there's prayers that you have prayed and God has come through and now your perspective on them has become something that you're complaining about, here's a healing invitation to remember that the God who showed up into a dark world to bring his light is doing the same thing now. So Jesus, we look to you. We're asking for you to move in our hearts. And as we sing, would you break in like only you can? Would you become king of our hearts, king of our lives? Would you help us to relinquish any control, any power, any pain that has got the death hold on our heart, and would we release it to you, the one that wants to heal us? A star is risen in Bethlehem. A light has shone. We don't want to squeeze you out this morning. So let's sing.